Hey, and welcome to this introduction to Excel. In this session, we're going to look at functions. Now, what is a function? Well, a function is the concept of a function is that it's a process where you take an input and you get an output. So, for example, a toaster is a function that turns sliced bread into toast. The main point of a function is that if you put in the same thing, you should always get out the same thing. So if you put in sliced bread in a toaster, you should always get out toast. Now we see, for example, if we write that this is that plus that, or D6 is B6 plus C6, 2 plus 3, we can see this is a function that adds B6 and C6 and gives the sum of those two. So if we put different things here, we get different results. If we put in different things, different input, we get different output in the cell. But if we put in the same thing, so 2 and 2 is 4, but if we put in the same 2 and 3, we should always get the same result, 5. So that is what a function is. Now this is a very simple function, but a function doesn't have to be mathematical. As we saw a toaster, it can be anything really that just, as long as you put in the same thing, returns the same output. Not the same output as input, but just the same input always produces the same output. So 2 and 3 always return 5. Sliced bread in a toaster always returns toast. You put something different in a toaster, like an ice cube, you get a different output, melted water. So don't put ice cubes in your toaster. There are a bunch of various functions that are built into Excel, and they have names that we can call on. So we can call on these functions. So for example, we can take the maximum of a function, or we can take the sum of a function. So these functions that are built into Excel and that we just call upon them to create them instead of making those calculations ourselves, how do they work? Well, they all have a name. And because they're function, they all take input. So there's a parenthesis that is the input into the function. Now, if we, I'm not gonna use this is just a placeholder. That's the name of the function. So I'm gonna put a parenthesis, an apostrophe here, so that we treat it as just as text. But we then have name and then the input. And so the input is here, we then refer to it. So we can write a 2, for example. Now some functions don't have any input, as in they don't need a specific, or we can say the input is nothing, or we say we don't, a 0, or something like that. So we can leave this empty. But most things, we want to put something specific into them. So that's what we do here, what we do with our input. And we can write certain things, or oftentimes what we do is references. So we reference something. So we reference, for example, B6, and it will reference B6. Now here, I'm just treating it as text, but if I remove this, we see that references B6. But sometimes you have lots of inputs. So if you have several things, you could take B6 and, for example, C6. So it does those two. And we separate those two by a semicolon. In some versions of Excel, instead of a semicolon, it's a comma, but in most cases, it's a semicolon. Sometimes you can put, you want to have an input that is a lot of things in one. So we'll look at that in a second. I'm just going to put the apostrophe there for a placeholder. Let's say we have some values here. We have 2, we have 4, 76, 6, 2, and 9. So what happens if we refer to these? Again, this function is just a placeholder. I'm just saying name here. It's the name of the function. I'm going to look at some specific ones in a second. But so if I refer to, for example, A3 and A7, I can look at that. Then I'm going to put in A3 and A7. Now what they does depends on the function. So this is just a generic. It can we don't know what it's going to do with this. We're just going to say we need some input. It's going to be these two. But if I want to select all of this, I would use a colon instead. Now we see that it selects all of this as input. So now everything is input. But otherwise it would be a semicolon, or in some versions a comma. So let's see an example of this. And now here I get an error term. It says name because it doesn't know what this function is, and it's not a real function. I'm going to do like that. So let's look at a function. So we have the max function. Now I start typing max function. I get these up here, so I can double click here, and I get I get capitalized letters, and I get the start of my parentheses, my input, and it takes the max of certain things. So I can take that. What's the max of this and that? The maximum between 2 and 9, which one is the biggest? That's what max returns. It looks at various numbers and says which one is the largest. And that is obviously 9, so we get 9 here. Now, if instead I want to compare all of these, I can just do a colon instead, and it's the max of all these. So from 2 to 9, and I get 76 as the biggest one. Now, a way to easily deal with functions and understand them is that if you're anywhere within them, let's do this again. If I have my mouse anywhere within the function, as I see here now in the name of the function or in the input of the function, and we see here down here, it says the name and it says the various input. So we get this little text box up here. Then I can click on this FX symbol. And if I do that, I get a box that explains my function. And it says here, okay, what's the name of the function? It's max. What are our inputs? That's here. What does the function do? It explains it right here. It returns the largest value in a set of values, ignores logical values in text. And then it explains this number 1 here. What is this? It's our 1 to 255 different numbers, empty cells, logical values, or text numbers for which you want the maximum. And it also gives us a little input. This is, in this case, it's all these things, this list of numbers. That's what we have here. And the maximum of those is 76, and we get the result will be 76. So if we instead write only A3, and we see here, if we have nothing here, we can just click now. So we can click for that, and here we take that, for example. Now we see it has added the semicolon here, the semicolon there. And we see that if we don't know if it's comma or semicolon, we can always use this text box because it will add the syntax here. And it's very nice in that sense to get an idea of what the function does, but also get the idea of what the syntax of the function is. Now, this is a very simple function that it doesn't matter where we add the input. It's just going to compare all the numbers, take the biggest one. But other functions might be more complex. You want to do certain things in certain ways, so it matters where you put the input, and you get that information in this box. Okay, so we get the max of these two is 9. We can try a different function. We can try the sum function. That adds all the numbers. So I try all of these, and I get 99. That's the sum of these. I see if this is true. I can equals that one plus A4 plus A5 plus A6 plus A7 plus A8. And we see get 99. So we now see the benefit that this can do quicker what we can otherwise do in Excel quite quickly, but this one is slightly quicker. And for some of these functions that are complex, it does it much quicker than we would do. We have other functions such as average. It takes the average of these 6 numbers and gets 16.5. Now, obviously, the average, it means the arithmetic mean. That means the sum of all these divided by the amount of them. So we have 99 as the sum. So we can take 99 here and divide by 6. We'll get 16.5. So, so that's another function. And so what functions do we have? The 2 things to note about functions is A, there might exist a function, but we need to know what it is in order to call upon it. So if we start writing SUM, we get various sum functions, including sum or some that has sum in them, either in the beginning or in the end or something like that. And if we double click on it, we get it. But if we don't know the name, it might be hard to call upon it. The second thing we need to know is that if we have Excel in a different language, the function names are in that language. So we have to be prepared to know whatever, if we have, for example, Excel in Swedish, what is the Swedish name of the function? So one way to know that is to click on the FX button. That is, when there's no function involved, it just inserts a function. So we get this little box and it says, okay. And so we start by selecting category, either the most recently used or all categories, or we look at financial functions, date and time functions, math and trigonometry functions, statistical functions, and so on. And there we can check various. So in statistical, we see we get the average function. Should also be able to get the sum function in here probably. They don't have the sum function. They have it under math. So in math, there should be the sum. Here we have the sum function. So we see we might be able to find it in that way. At least we should be able to find it under all. But it can be a little annoying. So we need to think about it. What it could be. We might want to Google it instead of looking at it in this way. But this way we can at least look around for our functions. And once we choose a function there, for example, we choose the sum function from most recently used, it adds it and also even adds a suggestion of what we want to add, A3 to D3 here. But okay, so now we've looked at functions, how they work, how we put input into them, how we can utilize the insert function button up here in order to get the help. And again, we see that what we get is the output, but the input we see here, right? And we can always access the input by pressing F.